Bonjour tout le monde. It is so good to be here with you all. Merci à Randy de m'avoir présenté avec autant d'enthousiasme. La barre est placée et j'espère être à la hauteur des attentes que tu viens de créer. D'ailleurs, Randy, c'est un honneur de suivre une personne avec une carrière aussi brillante qu'engagée. Ton travail auprès des jeunes, des organisations et des personnes à faible revenu est inspirant. Je suis très, très heureux d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. I guess we're all celebrating something. Chers amis, enfin, nous sommes enfin en 2016. It took so long coming. The last 10 years were so hard on our environment, our places in the world, and our collective soul. What a mess they left behind. But now we have a government that is hard at work. Businesses, NGOs, scientists, First Nations, provinces and territories, people and groups from all over seizing the opportunity, making Canada and the world a better place. Even science is back as a legitimate source for public policy. I was so happy to fill in the long-form census from StatsCan. On the issue of science, like Barack Obama once said, I'm not a scientist, but like him, I know many scientists. In fact, we now have, as opposed to the previous government, a Minister of Science who just so happens to be a scientist. And not only do we have a science minister who's a scientist, but Kirsty Duncan is a climate change scientist who's been working and witnessing the impacts of climate change in the North for over 20 years. Because we know that the world is changing, that some planetary threats, such as climate change, are real and urgent, and that Canada is now playing catch-up. We need to become part of the solution, again, and we need to grasp the opportunities our changing world are bringing. This is what I would like to focus on this morning. Nous ne pouvons plus ignorer que les changements climatiques nous affectent toutes et tous. À travers le monde, la dernière décennie a été la plus chaude jamais enregistrée. 15 des 16 dernières années les plus chaudes l'ont été depuis 2000. Les changements climatiques et leurs impacts font aujourd'hui partie de la nouvelle normale. Toutes nos pensées vont aux gens de Fort McMurray et de l'Alberta, aux prises avec les pires feux de forêt de leur histoire. Ces feux dévastateurs s'inscrivent aujourd'hui dans une succession de sécheresses et d'hivers cléments sur les prairies et la côte ouest, que les experts attribuent à la hausse des températures globales. La solidarité dont fait preuve la société canadienne est touchante. Dans les Maritimes et au Québec, nous vivons déjà l'érosion des côtes alors que s'élève le niveau des mers. La côte ouest et les Rocheuses sont aux prises avec des insectes parasites qui migrent du sud vers le nord et ravagent nos forêts. Et le pergélisol fond dans l'Arctique alors que le mode de vie des Inuits est durement touché. Il nous faut maintenant vivre avec cette nouvelle normale, nous adapter et travailler à rendre nos communautés plus résilientes et solidaires. Our planet is transitioning away fast from fossil fuel-based economies and energy systems in favor of renewable energy sources, clean technologies, and the understanding that our current patterns of consumption are simply unsustainable. Our governments, businesses, and civil society have to take this into serious consideration when planning the economic, environmental, and energy policies that will be with us for the years to come. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said last month, it's clear that the transition toward a global low-carbon economy is in full swing, and that every person on the planet has an interest in making sure that this transition happens as quickly as possible. Given the level of energy I feel around the country, I know we Canadians get it, and that we are up to this great challenge. It took a lot of hard work by faith groups, First Nations, social and environmental groups, progressive businesses and industries, and engaged Canadians such as you to get us here. Let's not forget that many of us, less than a year ago, were labeled as radicals and extremists by a federal government whose values belong to the beginning of the last century, where decisions were made by a few without transparency and with as little democratic control and accountability as possible. Le monde change. Les sociétés, les économies et les mentalités changent. Les leaders religieux de partout nous appellent à prendre soin de la création qui soutient la vie sur Terre. La grande majorité des Canadiens et Canadiennes acceptent la réalité des changements climatiques et veulent que nous agissions. La Colombie-Britannique, le Québec, l'Ontario, l'Alberta et le Manitoba, 80% de la population et de l'économie canadienne ont ou se donneront bientôt un prix sur le carbone. Isn't it just me, or isn't there some kind of poetic justice to the fact that Stephen Harper's going away present is Alberta imposing on him a carbon tax? Les marchés et l'environnement changent. Au cours des dernières années, les grandes compagnies de charbon aux États-Unis tombent comme des mouches. Et pendant ce temps, l'industrie mondiale des technologies propres et des énergies renouvelables a le vent dans les voiles. Pour la première fois l'an dernier, et malgré l'effondrement des prix du pétrole, du gaz et du charbon, plus d'argent a été investi pour développer des technologies renouvelables que pour développer la production d'énergie à partir de carburants fossiles. Selon les grandes agences financières, les investissements pour la production d'énergie renouvelable vont doubler d'ici 2030, alors que ceux destinés aux fossiles vont diminuer de moitié. La nouvelle donne, c'est l'arrivée massive sur les marchés du solaire, de l'éolien, de la géothermie, mais également des piles à combustible, des voitures électriques et du stockage de l'énergie. Ces technologies sont de plus en plus performantes et elles coûtent de moins en moins cher. La nouvelle donne, c'est le prix du carbone qui s'installe partout sur la planète, de la Chine en passant par l'Europe, le Canada et la Californie. Le charbon, le pétrole et le gaz sont de plus en plus pénalisés sur ces marchés. La nouvelle donne, ce sont des politiques gouvernementales qui encouragent les énergies et technologies propres et renouvelables. Cette nouvelle réalité, c'est aussi des groupes d'investisseurs mondiaux, avec des actifs sous gestion qui dépassent 3 400 milliards de dollars, qui désinvestissent des entreprises fossiles pour réinvestir leur argent dans les alternatives vertes. L'industrie du charbon est la première à se faire montrer la porte, victime d'un environnement d'affaires de plus en plus hostile. Ici, sur le continent, la valeur boursière des 4 grands géants américains du charbon était de 34 milliards de dollars en 2011. Il n'était plus que de 185 millions le mois dernier. Au cours de la dernière décennie, 230 centrales au charbon ont été fermées à travers les États-Unis. Au Canada, l'Ontario du gouvernement McGuinty a fermé toutes ses centrales au charbon, le plus important geste de réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre au Canada, sinon sur le continent. Et l'Alberta a annoncé qu'elle allait faire de même. En 2016, la Chine va investir plus dans les renouvelables que dans le charbon qui empoisonne ses villes. King Coal is being dethroned. Its political clout is waning. Governments are more and more hostile to it. Communities increasingly oppose it. New, cleaner technologies are kicking it out of the market. Oil is next. Oil will be increasingly challenged by the prices on carbon, by drastic reductions of the subsidies it has enjoyed over the last century, by aggressive government regulations and policies, and by a mobilized civil society that it says enough. Just 2 days ago, French oil giant Total announced that it was going to cut back on expensive tar sands development and avoid Arctic drilling. They added the 2 degrees Celsius scenario highlights that parts of the world's fossil fuel resources cannot be developed. This is the new normal. According to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, last year electric vehicle sales grew about 60% worldwide. That's interesting, because it's the same growth rate that helped the Ford Model T cruise past a horse and buggy in the 1910. Furthermore, they estimate that electric vehicle could displace oil demand by 2 million barrels a day as early as 2023, just 7 years from now. In my home province of Quebec, 5 years ago, we had 0 public charging stations for electric vehicles. 3 years ago, we had 15. Today, we have 800. By 2020, we'll have more than double that number. 4 years from now, it's going to be easier in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada to fill a car with electricity than it is today putting gasoline in it. C'est ça la nouvelle normale. C'est le Congrès du travail du Canada qui veut créer 1 million d'emplois verts au cours des 5 prochaines années. Ce sont des alliances entre écologistes, gens d'affaires, communautés et scientifiques qui s'entendent sur un prix du carbone, sur la réduction de la consommation de pétrole et sur l'idée de faire du Canada une puissance économique verte et propre. La nouvelle normale, c'est la société canadienne qui est en mouvement et qui rattrape son retard. It seems we have put a lot of our eggs in the fossil fuel basket in the last 10 years. By not doing enough to foster the green economy, we have missed on many economic opportunities. When oil price crashed, we were not as resilient as we should have been. Le Canada perd des parts de marché. Nous sommes maintenant au 19e rang des pays exportateurs de technologies propres. Nous étions au 11e rang en 2005. Nous devenons des importateurs de ces technologies au lieu de créer ici des champions mondiaux. So we are now playing catch-up, and not only economically. We have to regain the trust of the world community and show that we can be counted on to work hard and find solutions where everybody wins. In the last 10 years, being Canadian did not own you free drinks in the convention halls where we work long hours to reach an international deal on climate change. Quite the opposite. Being Canadian meant, to our colleagues from around the world, being from a country that opposed change at every turn, too busy to do as little as possible and to transfer the burden of action on everybody else's shoulders, especially developing countries, as well as on our kids and our grandkids. Longtime diplomats and activists missed Stéphane Dion's presence at COP11 in Montreal in 2005. There, he masterfully chaired a crucial two-week-long climate change negotiations marathon. Many were very glad to see him again last year as Canada's new Foreign Affairs Minister. Bravo Stéphane, et merci encore. A few months ago in Paris, with the new government, we worked hard to reach an historic climate accord that delivers a clear signal to all sectors of the world that the future will be low carbon. Now, and for the first time, all countries are to do their fair share. All sectors and jurisdictions are to contribute, including us. I got a very good first-row experience that the world is now seeing Canada through very different eyes when hundreds of people from around the world took up to take pictures of Justin Trudeau as he made a surprise appearance during a public event at the climate talks last December. Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, Indian Prime Minister Modi, as extraordinary leaders these are, they didn't get a second look. But the Prime Minister, oh boy, unbelievable. Being on the Canadian diplomatic delegation at the talks in Paris, I saw how Canada is now welcomed back as a valued member of the international community. Our new Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, Catherine McKenna, barely a few weeks on the job, arrived that she was made chair of one of the key negotiating groups and tasked to hammer a consensus on some very delicate issues plaguing the talks. She worked around the clock and did her job getting the deal signed, pushing hard for tougher global targets. Since then, Catherine is flying all over the country, talking to provincial and territorial counterparts, making sure we come up with a plan to implement the Paris Accord and quickly drive down our emissions. Catherine, you sleep at all? Nous récoltons aujourd'hui, en 2016, ce que nous avons semé hier. Les politiques que nous mettons en place maintenant sont les rêves des 10, 15, 20 dernières années qui ont été portés jusqu'aux dirigeants politiques au pouvoir aujourd'hui. Lorsqu'un petit groupe de jeunes universitaires québécois a créé Equiterre dans la cuisine d'un triplex à Montréal il y a 20 ans, ils se sont donné la mission de changer le monde. Nous n'avons pas gagné toutes nos batailles, loin de là, mais nous avons fait des pas de géant. Que de travail pour arriver devant vous aujourd'hui et pour pouvoir affirmer que le monde change, qu'une nouvelle donne prend forme, que les mentalités évoluent et que nous sommes en transition vers une société décarbonisée. La vision que nous avions prend forme, mais il a fallu travailler très fort pour y arriver. Pour qu'elle s'installe pour de bon et que nos actions soient suffisantes pour éviter les pires impacts des changements climatiques, il nous faudra agir vite et avec résolution tout au long des prochaines décennies. La transition dans laquelle nous nous sommes engagés exige 3 choses. Premièrement, nous avons besoin d'un engagement personnel de la part des hommes et femmes politiques, de ceux et celles qui les conseillent et les soutiennent, des leaders de la société civile. Et nous avons besoin du soutien de la population. Nous avons également besoin de constance dans l'action des gouvernements. Nous ne pouvons plus nous permettre que l'enjeu des changements climatiques devienne un enjeu partisan. Et troisièmement, nous devons faire preuve de cohérence. Il est parfois trop facile en politique de faire une chose et son contraire. Long-term personal commitment from decision makers, steadfast public policies, and coherence. This is what we need if we are to rise up to the challenge of climate change. Let us avoid the sirens' calls of some who would want us to delay change and squeeze a little bit more profits from the known causes of our collective problems. Last time we spoke, Prime Minister Trudeau encouraged me to speak my mind and push hard whenever I felt we might collectively err. Let's talk pipeline then. Prime Minister, you famously said on a number of occasions that government give permits, but communities give permission. I believe you feel, quite correctly, that social license should be earned by promoters, not imposed on communities and populations. We understand that governments can sometimes override communities in cases of national security or life and death situations. But these pipeline projects have nothing to do with national security. In a world that is increasingly squeezing oil out of the market, our economic future does not rest on our capacity to get more. Prime Minister, large pipeline projects have failed to gain social license from all across the continent, from Lincoln, Nebraska, to Kitimat, BC, to Montreal, Quebec. Communities don't want them. The atmosphere and our climate certainly don't need them. And many of us believe we cannot build pipelines and meet our international climate commitments at the same time. And with the world working around the clock to avoid the worst effect of climate change, it makes no sense from an ethical and a moral perspective to produce and ship more of a substance that is causing a problem that disrupts the future of our children and grandchildren. There are much better things to do. I know this is hard for some of you to hear, but I believe it to be the truth, and I'm not the only one. Former Bank of Canada, Mark Carney, now Governor of the Bank of England, spelled it out for us 2 years ago when he said, the vast majority of fossil fuel reserves are unburnable if we are to avoid catastrophic climate change. That means we have to stop pumping more and start thinking about what comes next. This is why he and former Mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, have launched an initiative to encourage businesses to assess their financial risks in the context of increased global action on climate change. They say to companies that acting as if their business environment is not changing fast is a recipe for financial disaster. They say to those who act as if business as usual is still the norm will pay dearly for their mistakes. So as a country, let's take stock of this and move on. Let's focus on economic diversification and training and retraining Canadians for the green and greener jobs that are in demand right now and will be for the decades to come. Instead of locking us in the fossil fuel system that the world is turning its back to, let's help oil and gas producing provinces and communities transition and become better off of it. À Davos, en Suisse, au Forum économique mondial, vous avez dit, Monsieur le Premier ministre, que les Canadiens devaient miser sur ce qu'ils ont entre les deux oreilles pour assurer leur développement. Je suis tout à fait d'accord avec vous. Et ce message doit résonner partout à travers le Canada, dans toutes les provinces et les territoires. We should all be seeing our emissions go down, not planning policies that have them go up. This applies to Quebec, with potential oil and gas production in and around the Gulf of St. Lawrence, home to the beluga and blue whales. It applies to BC, tempted to okay a massive LNG project that could become Canada's largest point source of emission. And it applies to Alberta, who, despite a stupefying reversal of its energy and climate policies, is still banking on increased level of climate-disrupting pollution for the foreseeable future. Commitment, steadfastness, and coherence. This is what we need right now, in solidarity and with a helping hand for those of us who could lose from the transition to a cleaner and greener world. Impossible is an attitude. A few months ago, it was all but impossible to hope that things were going to change dramatically in Canada or around the world on climate change. But then again, impossible is not a fact. it's an attitude, said a few weeks ago Cristina Figueres, climate czarina at the United Nations and a formidable world leader. Reflecting on the Paris Accord that seemed impossible just a few months ago, she said unflinching optimism was the key. She told us to understand optimism as courage, hope, trust, solidarity, and the fundamental belief that we can come together and make this a better place and a better world, and create a new normal. Merci beaucoup et bon congrès.